Berlin to celebrate the appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Powerful German industrialists and businessmen had helped position Hitler for his rise to Führer. Just 1 month later, after Hitler's appointment to Chancellor in February of that year, Hitler set fire to the German parliament building called the Reichstag and blamed it on a communist plot. Not long after the incident, and at Hitler's urging, the German president at the time, President Paul von Hindenburg, caved to the mounting political pressure stemming from Hitler's powerful political allies and responded with the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended basic rights and allowed indefinite detention without trial of all German citizens. Activities of the German Communist Party were then since suppressed, and some 4,000 Communist Party members arrested. Since taking office in 2008, on the promise of hope and change, President Barack Obama has launched an aggressive assault on America's liberty. He has armed America's enemies through Benghazi, violating his oath of office by sending monies and weapons of war to insurgents in Syria led by al-Qaeda terrorists. He has violated federal law by overseeing a cover-up surrounding Attorney General Eric Holder's Operation Fast and Furious and the running of guns to Mexican drug cartels. He has lied to the American people by overseeing a cover-up of the September 11th Benghazi terror attack in Libya, which led directly to the deaths of 4 American citizens. He has bypassed Congress using executive order prior to the attack on Libya, insisting that congressional approval was not necessary. He has signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act, which includes provisions that permit the abduction and military detention without trial of all U.S. citizens, violating habeas corpus and Americans' right to a fair trial. And on January 16, 2013, surrounded by children to play to Americans' emotions, he has signed 23 different executive orders for broader gun control in the United States.
Now to a story that critics say is already a foreign policy scandal.
I think it is explained explicitly because of what's happened over the last several weeks with Libya and Egypt and in 30 other capitals where our embassies have been targeted for attack.
I believe that much of this will come back to weapons and the movement of weapons out of Libya to Turkey and then into Syria.
Let's just get blunt. No way to sugarcoat this. We've been lied to.
And what the United States knew about the movement of those weapons and whether it did anything to stop the movement of those weapons. I have one piece of data that says Ambassador Stevens was in Benghazi on 9/11 to negotiate a weapons transfer.
We've flat out been lied to. They know they've lied. It's as if airplanes crashing into the World Trade Center and somebody says those were just accidents, the planes veered off course. Everybody with 2 eyes and IQ above plant life understands that what happened in Egypt and what happened in Libya was not some spontaneous reaction to a stupid 13-minute video on YouTube. It was a planned, coordinated, orchestrated attack led by terrorist bill. And this White House has to explain why it hasn't owned up to that, why it can't say it. And I think, frankly, if this issue really gets the traction that it deserves, and let me say that it deserves. Let's go back. Richard Nixon was forced out of office because he lied and because he covered some stuff up. I'm going to be blunt and tell you this. Nobody died in Watergate. We have some people who are dead because of this, and there's some questions to be answered, and Americans ought to demand to get answers.
On September 11, 2001, the United States suffered the largest domestic terrorist attack in the history of America. Approximately 1 month later, on October 26th, the Patriot Act was signed into law by President George W. Bush. The Patriot Act specifically expanded Washington's definition of terrorism to include domestic terrorism, thus enlarging the number of activities to which the Patriot Act's expanded law enforcement powers could be applied. The response to September 11th also led to the formation of the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security. On December 31, 2011, President Barack Obama signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act, better known as the NDAA. The detention sections of the NDAA give President Barack Obama absolute power to indefinitely detain anyone they suspect to be a terrorist via the armed forces, any person, including U.S. citizens, without trial. President Obama is now enacting sweeping gun control legislation in order to protect our children, which he says is America's #1 priority, from violent massacres like Sandy Hook. So what can history tell us about gun control, and what can we learn from it? In 1911, Turkey established gun control. From 1915 to 1917, 1.5 million Armenians, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. Germany established gun control in 1938, and from 1939 to 1945, leaving the German people unable to defend themselves against the Gestapo and SS, millions of people were exterminated. China established gun control in 1935. From 1948 to 1952, 20 million political dissidents, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. Guatemala established gun control in 1964. From 1964 to 1981, 100,000 Mayan Indians, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. Uganda established gun control in 1970. From 1971 to 1979, 300,000 Christians, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. The total exterminated is said to be between 2 to 3 million people. Cambodia established gun control in 1956. From 1975 to 1977, 1 to 2 million well-educated people, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. These are just a few historical examples of mass genocide, and there are many, too many to count. The total amount of people rounded up and exterminated in the 20th century alone because of gun control is estimated to be at least 56 million people at a bare minimum. These are astonishing figures, and they're hard to argue with. Gun control, using history as our guide, has a very high correlation with the extermination and genocide of a defenseless and unarmed population.